The streets of Okembi were busy and alive as Ngozi hurried through the market, excitement bubbling in her chest. Tonight was the night she had been dreaming of for weeks, a grand dinner to celebrate 10 years of marriage with her husband, Chuka. She had invited all their friends and relatives, wanting everyone to see how strong and happy their family was. At home, the kitchen was full of wonderful smells as caterers cooked Chuka's favorite dishes. Laughter filled the air as Ngozi's cousins helped set the long dining table with sparkling plates and tall glasses. She carefully chose flowers to place around the house, making sure everything looked perfect. As the sun set, the garden lit up with fairy lights and lanterns, giving the house a magical glow. Guests arrived in colourful clothes, bringing gifts and warm smiles. Children played and ran around the yard, while music drifted through the evening air. Ngozi floated from guest to guest, welcoming everyone with hugs and bright laughter. She wore a beautiful emerald dress that shimmered in the light, and every time someone complimented her, she thought of how happy Chuka would be when he arrived. She pictured him smiling proudly, seeing all their loved ones gathered to celebrate them. Standing by the door, Ngozi's heart was full of joy and hope. She believed this night would be the best of their lives, a memory to cherish forever. The dinner was in full swing, with guests laughing and sharing stories, the warm glow of lanterns making the night feel magical. The smell of spicy jollof rice, fried plantains and grilled fish filled the air. Ngozi moved through the room, her heart bursting with happiness as she watched everyone enjoy the night she had worked so hard to plan. All that was missing was Chuka. Every time headlights flashed outside, she rushed to the window, hoping it was him. Then, finally, a car pulled up. Ngozi's heart leaped with joy as she smoothed her dress and hurried to the entrance, ready to welcome her husband. But when the door opened, everything stopped. Chuka stepped inside, but he wasn't alone. Clinging to his arm was a young woman with smooth skin, a tight red dress, and a smirk on her face. The room fell silent. Even the children stopped playing. All eyes were on Chuka and the stranger beside him. Chuka looked around, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Everyone!" he announced loudly, his voice booming through the stunned silence. "This is Tari, my new girlfriend." He said it so casually, like he was introducing a business partner. Ngozi felt the world spin around her. Her chest tightened and her hands shook as she tried to steady herself on the back of a chair. She looked into Chuka's eyes, searching for any sign of love, of the man she married, but there was nothing but cold arrogance. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the faces of their guests, who stared in shock and disbelief. Tari glanced around the room with a smug smile, enjoying the uncomfortable silence. She ran her hand possessively over Chuka's chest, as if staking her claim. Some guests gasped quietly, others looked away in shame for Ngozi, their hearts breaking for her. The music had stopped, the air heavy with betrayal. Ngozi stood frozen, unable to move or speak, her dream dinner turning into a nightmare before her eyes. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Guests sat frozen with half-eaten food on their plates, eyes darting between Chuka, the smirking young woman beside him, and Ngozi standing like a statue by the table. The once joyful dinner was now filled with a thick, choking silence. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others whispered in disbelief. Children clung to their mothers, sensing something was very wrong. Chuka cleared his throat loudly, as if he was about to make a toast. His smile was wide, but it was cruel, sharp. "I want everyone here to know," he began, his voice ringing through the hushed room, "that I am done pretending. I want a fresh start. Tari is my new beginning." He squeezed Tari's hand, and she giggled, her eyes shining with pride as if she had just won a prize. A loud gasp came from Mama Ifua, Ngozi's mother, who stood up so fast her chair fell back with a thud. Her face was red with rage and pain. "Chuka!" she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at him. "Get out of this house now! How dare you do this to my daughter? How dare you disgrace this family?" Her voice cracked with emotion, but Chuka just laughed, a cold, mocking sound that echoed off the walls. "Disgrace!" he sneered, glancing around at the horrified guests. "The only disgrace here is Ngozi. She's old, boring, and has nothing exciting left in her. I need someone young and fresh, someone like Tari." His words were like knives, cutting through Ngozi's heart as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. A wave of murmurs rolled through the guests, some shaking their heads, others covering their mouths in shock. The beautiful dinner Ngozi had spent weeks planning was now a battlefield of humiliation. The fairy lights seemed dimmer, the music still silent as Chuka's cruel words hung in the air. Ngozi's world had shattered in front of everyone she loved, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The room was already heavy with shock when Tari stepped forward, her high heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. She held onto Chuka's arm like he was a trophy, her chin lifted with an air of arrogance that made everyone's skin crawl. She looked Ngozi up and down with a smirk, her eyes filled with cruel amusement. "Oh, this is too funny," Tari said loudly, her voice dripping with mockery. She pointed at Ngozi, who stood trembling, trying to hold back her tears. "Look at her, everyone. Just look at this pathetic woman. Did you really think you could keep a man like Chuka forever?" Her words cut deeper than any knife, leaving Ngozi's heart in pieces. Gasps and angry murmurs spread across the dinner table. Some guests put their hands over their mouths. Others shook their heads, unable to believe the shamelessness unfolding before them. Mama Afua clutched her chest, her face pale with shock and fury. Tari flipped her long hair over her shoulder, clearly enjoying the attention. "I'll be moving in here soon," she announced boldly, her eyes sweeping the grand dining room. "I think I'll start by redecorating this old-fashioned place. Maybe something younger, fresher, like me." She let out a laugh that rang cruelly through the silent room, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Whispers broke out among the guests, some outraged, others simply stunned into silence. A few women reached for Ngozi's hand, their eyes filled with sympathy and disbelief. But Tari continued as if she owned the house already, running her fingers across the expensive cutlery and fine china Ngozi had so lovingly arranged for the dinner. Chuka watched her with an approving smirk, his arm still around her waist. Ngozi felt the world close in around her. The dinner that was meant to celebrate love had turned into her deepest nightmare. She stood there, tears streaming down her face, as the woman who stole her husband boasted about taking over her home and life, right in front of everyone she loved. The air was thick with tension and whispered outrage as Tari's cruel words lingered in the room. Guests sat frozen, their eyes darting between the arrogant young woman and Ngozi, whose face was pale but composed. Inside, Ngozi felt like her world was crashing down, but outside she stood tall, her back straight despite the tears that still glistened in her eyes. Slowly, she took a deep breath and looked around the room. She caught the eyes of her mother, her cousins, and the friends who had known her since childhood. She refused to give Tari the satisfaction of seeing her break. With quiet grace, Ngozi placed her napkin on the table and spoke softly but firmly. "Excuse me, everyone," she said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the storm inside her. "I need a moment." She walked away from the table, head held high, every step filled with quiet strength. The guests parted silently as she passed, their hearts breaking for her, but also filled with admiration for the dignity she carried in that moment. Upstairs, she entered her bedroom, closing the door behind her as her body finally sagged with exhaustion and pain. A few moments later, her cousin Kweku, who had always been like a brother to her, knocked gently and stepped inside. His eyes were red with anger and worry. "Ngozi, don't do this," he pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't let them win. You've worked too hard, loved too deeply. Please fight for what's yours." Ngozi turned to him slowly, wiping the last of her tears from her cheeks. Her eyes, though tired, were fierce and determined. "I am not giving up, Kweku," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I know exactly what I need to do." She stood up straighter, her chin lifted as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. Gone was the woman broken by betrayal. In her place stood someone ready to take control of her life. "They think they can destroy me," she whispered, her eyes flashing with resolve. "But they have no idea who they're dealing with." Kweku nodded, hope returning to his eyes as he realized that beneath Ngozi's calm surface burned a fire that could not be put out. The guests sat stiffly at the dinner table, their forks barely touching the desserts in front of them. A heavy silence hung over the room, broken only by the occasional clink of a spoon or the nervous cough of someone trying to breathe through the tension. The fairy lights, once so warm and cheerful, now seemed cold and harsh, throwing long shadows across the faces of friends and family, still reeling from the night's shocking events. Then, footsteps echoed from the stairs. Every head turned as Ngozi appeared at the top, her emerald dress flowing behind her like a queen's robe. Her eyes were no longer wet with tears. They were clear, sharp, and focused. In her hands, she held a large brown envelope. She descended each step slowly, deliberately, her gaze locked on Chuka and Tari, who sat at the table looking smug and comfortable. Without a word, Ngozi reached the head of the table and placed the envelope directly in front of Chuka. The thud of it hitting the wood sounded louder than it should have, making everyone flinch. Chuka looked up, confused and irritated by her calm presence. Tari shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering for the first time. Chuka snatched up the envelope, ripping it open with a scoff. But the moment he pulled out the papers, his expression changed. His eyes darted back and forth across the documents, his face draining of colour with every line he read. His hands began to shake as he realised what he was holding. Divorce papers, signed and dated, making it clear Ngozi had already started the process. Attached to them were property deeds, bank statements, and legal papers proving Ngozi was the sole owner of every house, business, and asset they had shared. Gasps rose around the table as guests craned their necks to see what had shocked Chuka so badly. Tari leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening in horror as she read the words that destroyed everything she thought she was about to inherit. Ngozi stood tall, her voice calm, and even as she finally spoke, "You thought I was weak," she said softly, her eyes locked on Chuka. "But I was protecting myself, my son, and everything I built. You wanted a fresh start. Now you can have it. With nothing." The room erupted into a wave of whispers and stunned disbelief as Ngozi took her seat, her head high and her heart unbroken. Chuka's hands trembled as he flipped through the papers, his eyes wide with shock and fear. The confident smirk he had worn all evening was gone, replaced by a pale, sweaty face that looked like it might crumble at any second. He read each line again and again, hoping he had misunderstood. But the words were clear. Ngozi had already filed for divorce, and she alone owned every property, every car, every bank account, everything they had once shared. The guests around the table gasped as they realized what the documents meant. Some leaned closer to get a better look. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. The same people who had pitied Ngozi minutes before now stared at her with new respect. Whispers spread like wildfire. "She planned this. She owns everything. He has nothing left." Chuka's eyes darted desperately to Ngozi, who sat across from him with calm, steady eyes. He searched her face for any sign of pity or softness, but all he found was quiet strength. He turned to Tari, but she had already pulled her hand away from his, her eyes wide with horror as she realized the man she thought was rich was now penniless. "Is this a joke?" Chuka croaked, his voice barely above a whisper as his eyes pleaded with Ngozi. But Ngozi simply shook her head slowly, her face calm. "It's over, Chuka," she said quietly, but everyone heard her words as if she had shouted them. "I won't let you humiliate me anymore." Chuka's mind raced. His dreams of starting over with Tari, of living off the wealth he once shared with Ngozi, vanished like smoke. He imagined himself alone, homeless, his reputation in ruin, his body slumped, the weight of what he had lost too heavy to bear. The people he once thought he could impress were now staring at him with disgust or pity. Around him, the dinner party was silent except for the occasional shocked whisper. The beautiful home he had walked into so confidently now felt like a prison closing in on him. Chuka realized far too late that his greed and arrogance had destroyed everything, and there was no going back. Tari's confident smile vanished the moment she read the papers over Chuka's shoulder. Her eyes darted across the words, her lips moving soundlessly as she tried to process what it all meant. The colour drained from her face, leaving her pale and wide-eyed like a child caught stealing. She looked around the room, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes staring at her with disgust. The whispers that filled the air felt like knives cutting into her skin. She shifted uncomfortably, her hand dropping from Chuka's shoulder as if it burned her. The expensive ring she'd shown off earlier now looked cheap and meaningless. She slowly stood up, trying to slip away from the table without drawing more attention. But as she took a step toward the door, Two of Ngozi's cousins moved to block her path. Their eyes were cold, their arms crossed over their chests. "Where are you going?" one of them asked loudly, his voice carrying across the hushed room. A wave of murmurs followed as guests turned in their chairs to watch. "Weren't you just boasting about moving in here?" Another guest called out, anger in her voice. Tari's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She glanced at Chuka for help, but he sat slumped over the papers, completely shattered and useless. She tried again to push past, but hands reached out to stop her, and a chorus of voices rose around her, each one filled with righteous anger. "You thought you could just walk in and steal another woman's life," someone shouted. "Shameless!" another guest hissed. The words stung, and Tari's eyes filled with tears as she realized she was trapped, exposed for everyone to see the truth. She was nothing but a gold digger who had bet on the wrong man. Her dreams of fancy cars, designer clothes, and a life of comfort disappeared like mist. The grand house she imagined living in was slipping through her fingers, replaced by the cold reality that Chuka had nothing to offer. Tari's legs felt weak, her heart pounding in her ears as she stood frozen, surrounded by the very people she had planned to impress. She finally understood the depth of her mistake and knew there was no way to undo the shame she had brought upon herself. The room fell into a tense, expectant silence as Ngozi slowly stood up from her chair. She looked around at the faces of her friends and family, the same people who had come to celebrate what they thought was a strong marriage. Her eyes were calm, her shoulders squared. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, ringing through the dining room like a bell. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began softly, but with a strength that made everyone lean in to listen. This was supposed to be a celebration of love and family, but tonight has shown us something even more important. It has shown us the truth. She paused, letting her words sink in as she looked at each person in the room. She glanced briefly at Chuka and Tari, who stood frozen and ashamed, before turning back to her guests. "Sometimes the people we trust the most betray us," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Sometimes we are broken, humiliated, made to feel small, but we must remember, our worth does not come from someone else's approval. It comes from within us." A tear rolled down Mama Afua's cheek as she listened, and many others began to sniffle quietly. Ngozi's voice never wavered. "Tonight, I stand here not as a woman defeated by betrayal, but as a woman who knows her value, a woman who refuses to be treated as less than she is. And I want every woman here to remember, you are stronger than you think, you are enough, and you never have to settle for someone who doesn't see your worth." The room erupted in applause, the sound loud and fierce. Some guests stood, clapping with tears streaming down their faces. Others reached out to hold Ngozi's hands, their eyes shining with admiration. The same house that had been filled with cruelty moments before now felt warm with love and support. As the applause continued, Ngozi smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of peace and power she had never known before. In that moment, she knew she had not only reclaimed her life, she had inspired everyone in the room to believe in themselves too. The next morning, word spread through Okembi like a storm. Everyone heard how Chuka had been exposed at his own anniversary dinner, how he had tried to humiliate Ngozi, but ended up destroying himself instead. People whispered about how he packed a single bag and left the house he once bragged about owning, now knowing he had nothing and nowhere to go. His friends stopped answering his calls, and his business partners backed away, not wanting to be associated with his shame. By the end of the week, Chuka was sleeping on a friend's old couch, alone and broken, his reputation in ruins. Meanwhile, Ngozi stepped into a new life with a fierce determination. She expanded her business, opening new shops and hiring women who had also suffered in abusive marriages. She started a foundation to help them rebuild their lives, offering jobs, legal help, and a safe place to heal. Her story spread across Okembi and beyond, shared in markets, offices, and churches. People spoke of her bravery and strength, how she refused to let betrayal define her. Everywhere she went, women stopped her on the street to thank her for giving them hope. Men who once dismissed her now treated her with deep respect. Ngozi's name became a symbol of resilience and power. She walked taller than ever, knowing she had turned her deepest pain into a new beginning, not just for herself, but for many others who needed someone to show them the way out of the darkness.